One of the main facets of cottagecore is escaping heteropatriarchal society, but this escape is to an imagined and romanticized image of stolen native lands. Despite attempts to disavow colonialism, the white queer is still firmly rooted and complicit within the structure of present and future heteropatriarchal colonialism and white supremacy, according to Smith 2010. It is therefore important to recognize and acknowledge the settler colonial basis of narratives of sexuality and gender within this society, in the structure of settler colonialism. It is then subsequently necessary to understand the cottagecore aesthetic by understanding the relational nature between colonialism, patriarchy, modern sexuality regimes, and gender. Cottagecore aims to escape patriarchy and modern regimes of sexuality, but does not aim to deconstruct them, and is therefore reinforcing the structure of ongoing settler colonialism. Cottagecore also has a problem of being highly commodifiable and can be easily moved into a part of the hyper-consumerism model of modern capitalism. Elements of cottagecore are very noticeable in the summer 2020 fashion as well as into the fall, with sun-drenched models and dreamy campaign imagery. It is likely this was an opportunity to capitalize on the summer that people did not get to have, based within the illusion of escapism to a cottage lifestyle. Only this time, this is being sold to everyday consumers. Cottagecore was commodified by high fashion brands such as Gucci, Simon Rocha, Cecily Bonson, as well as more affordable brands like H&M and Free People. The commodification of this aesthetic is based in the same romanticization of nature, beautiful curated landscapes, but with the added caveat that modern capitalism and hyperconsumerism is at the heart of environmental devastation and destruction of these lands, according to Kendall 2020. This is not only an issue of commodifying the aesthetic of cottagecore within material objects, but also commodifying the aesthetic of cottagecore based in the escapism, with video games such as Animal Crossing, Farmville, and the virtual experiences of living in nature in a cottage or on a farm. What started as a small digital culture and aesthetic for queer women and youth has become highly commodifiable, whether that is in high fashion, fast fashion, or terraforming video games. Olivia warns in her 2020 article that one should be careful with the romanticization of pastoral living because of its extremely dark history and connections to ongoing settler colonialism. Cottagecore's base of women and queer people makes it easy to consider it wholesome and harmless, as well as apolitical and ahistorical. But that is a shield used to more easily disregard the sinister and harmful aspects of cottagecore, which is the history of ongoing settler colonialism. The cottagecore aesthetic has the ability to both ignore the history of colonialism in favor of a fictionalized escapist fantasy and also reinforced a re-romanticization of colonialism and pastoral frontier living. Arguments in defense of cottagecore often use the aesthetic as refashioning and reinvigorating the appreciation of nature, which has been difficult due to life during lockdown in a pandemic. But from a critical perspective, is that argument valid? Sloan 2020 argues that cottagecore depicts a wholly unrealistic life that is so filtered beyond reality that it is therefore able to be apolitical and ahistorical, but that does not negate the romanticization of frontier and pastoral living and the ongoing history of settler colonialism. I argue that cottagecore is an attempt and an example of what Gandhi 2006 called ecological nostalgia for an imagined past. The cottagecore aesthetic is similar to the 18th century concept of the semi-wild aesthetic, which was a fascination with romanticized, picturesque, idealized nature. It was visual simulacrum, as is the cottagecore aesthetic. Woolley 2020 explains that for some, Cottagecore is an idealized nature where queer people can be visibly queer in rural spaces. Cottagecore, though, does not intend on this. It intends on not to preserve nature, but instead to edit and curate nature for a beautiful imitation of the real, just like the semi-wild aesthetic explained by Gandhi 2013. Morganson stated that settler colonialism functions under its own ideology to project any empty lands as the new frontier. For many, physical space, nature, farmland are hard to come by, which allows for many to explore the colonial frontier of virtual spaces, video games, specifically terraforming games such as Minecraft, Animal Crossing, Farmville, and Stardew Valley. According to Scott Nisbrown, these terraforming games allow players the ability to terraform and develop lands to their own liking. The intertwining of terraforming games and the aesthetic of cottagecore allow for the ability to emulate and curate cottagecore ideals of land cultivation, either through the game's own built-in assets or community-created assets. This allows for the continued romanticization of pastoral living and developing and curating lands for oneself in virtual spaces. So, in conclusion, the aesthetic of cottagecore paired with pandemic living and a predominantly queer-based demographic allows for an interesting exploration into sapphic escapist fantasy. Despite escapism being a central tenet of this aesthetic movement, cottagecore is unable to exist within an ahistorical and apolitical escapist fantasy world, as it is a part of the same legacy of settler colonialism that it inherits from its romanticism origins, as well as its uncanny similarity to tradwife aesthetics. Cottagecore's attempt to escape the heteropatriarchal without attempting to decolonize, therefore allows the legacy of settler colonialism to persist within this aesthetic. Cottagecore has fashioned itself as a seemingly wholesome and beautiful escapist aesthetic, has, especially within the midst of a pandemic, made itself an extremely viable digital experience to commercialize within fashion and also terraforming video games. Through these games, the players can live out their pastoral living fantasies, which works to translate settler colonial visions and colonizer vibes from the real and practical world to the digital realm. This video essay seeks to raise questions about the pertinent issues that surround the cottagecore aesthetic and to address the ways in which ongoing settler colonialism has continued to pervade contemporary aesthetic movements. I want to state that I have neither the formal background nor much experience in applying decolonial practices. Therefore, I do not want to risk my privileged position placing my voice over that of another. I hope this video presentation covered the breadth of the topic effectively enough to create a space to question escapisms and the colonial legacy surrounding the cottagecore aesthetic.